Psychology. Hi everyone, please make sure that you mute yourselves. Okay, everyone, I'm going to get started. I'm not going to wait for people. And yeah, as always, you can ask a question in the chat or just raise your hand if you want to interrupt me. And yeah, let's get started. Okay. Do I get back to Zoom? All right. So today we're going to be doing our lecture on neurotransmitters. And this is our 9th lecture out of 13. Remember, we'll have one tomorrow at 12:20. It won't be pre-recorded as per the schedule. Then on Thursday, we'll have one at 2:15. And then next week, Monday and Tuesday, we'll have our last 2. And then obviously Wednesday next week is a public holiday. And then Thursday and Friday, you'll be writing your test. Just some housekeeping before we get started. I have uploaded information about your tutorial, which is on Friday, the 22nd, which is this Friday. And all that information you can find on our course page, and your tutor should be in touch with you sometime within this week, and details are there about all of that. Okay, if you have any questions about that, you're welcome to pop me an email or ask at the end of this lecture. Okay, so neurotransmitters. We spoke a little bit about neurotransmitters the other day. They're basically like, they help to carry electrical impulses or neural impulses from one neuron to another neuron and past the synapse. So that's what neurotransmitters do. We'll talk about, I think, 6 or 7 different neurotransmitters and a little bit of background information before that regarding neurotransmitters. And that's basically the whole lecture. Okay, so our contents, we're first going to talk about synapse firing again. That's obviously what we were doing on Thursday last week, but I just wanted to recap a little bit. We're then going to chat about amino acids. Amino acids are precursors to proteins, and most neurotransmitters are actually proteins. So most of them are made up of amino acids. Then we're going to talk about 7 neurotransmitters that are quite important for us to know. Acetylcholine is one we've chatted about before, as well as dopamine. We're also going to be talking about histamine, glutamate, GABA, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Okay, that one also might sound a bit familiar to you. Okay, the star of our things today is Susie. It's Alistair's dog. You won't know Alistair. He's a bit too old, but he is an ex-rodent, like you will all be one day. I'm going to start recording, so I'm just going to go to the first slide again and just take us through what we're doing. Okay, so neurotransmitters, lecture 9. Contents, we're going to start off recapping synapse firing. Then we're going to go into amino acids, which make up neurotransmitters, and then we will speak about 7 different neurotransmitters. Okay, so synapse firing, this should be familiar to us. It's something we covered last week, Thursday, and a little bit on Wednesday as well. So just for us to refresh our memories a little bit, synapse firing, when there's a signal being sent from a neuron, okay, it has to pass something called a synapse, which is a gap between this neuron and the neuron that it wants to send it to. Because remember, neurons, they all form long chains together and they all send signals along each other. Synapse firing is basically what happens at the synapse, which is the gap between the one neuron and the other neuron. The neuron that the impulse is coming from is called the presynaptic neuron or the sending neuron. Okay. And then everything after the synapse, or once it crosses the synapse, it will be a receiving neuron or a postsynaptic neuron. So let's read here together. The signal being sent from the presynaptic neuron attaches to a neurotransmitter at the synapse. You can see he has a little zoomed in thing of it. So the impulse is coming down like this. These little neurotransmitters will then attach to them and basically help them carry across the synaptic cleft. It says here, the neurotransmitter helps the signal to jump the synaptic cleft. So it basically gives it a bit of a piggyback ride across here. The neurotransmitter is going to attach to a corresponding receptor on the postsynaptic receiving neuron. So this is the next neuron. And then because of this, a cellular response will be carried out. So other than that signal will then travel through that neuron again to another neuron, to another neuron, to another neuron, or it could reach its site where it needed to go. So say a muscle, and then a cellular response will be undertaken in those muscle cells. Okay, I see someone's raised their hand. Would you like to speak?
My apologies if this is, I know you've addressed this a bit, but in what sort of depth will we need to know these diagrams? Because I know some of them are quite different in terms of the ways in which they've been depicted in some of the previous PowerPoints.
All right, thank you for that question. So I don't expect you, I'm not going to give this to you and ask you to label it. I don't think I'm going to give you any kind of diagram and ask you to label it. I will want you to kind of know what's going on. So if I gave you this and I said, what process is this? You could say it's synapse firing. Okay, it will be that kind of thing. At this level, and I mean, also remembering from our own, when I was doing BioPsych 101 back in the day, I don't remember us ever having to label things, okay? Obviously, you need to know some of these individual things. Like today, we're talking about a neurotransmitter. The other day, we were talking about receptors and how that's what the receptor site is where the neurotransmitter meets, okay? You need to know the concept of a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. And you need to know the concept of that signal kind of coming through the presynaptic neuron, jumping across the synapse with a neurotransmitter, and then carrying on. So the diagrams are kind of here just to assist and illustrate rather than you needing to actually know these things off by heart. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Anyone else want any clarification regarding that? All right, let me carry on then. There you go. So this was that drawing that I had included in the previous slides for lecture 8. We see how when the impulse carries along, there's depolarization happening over here, and that means all those channels open up, and then that kind of carries on, and then these channels will open up and they're depolarized. These channels open up and they'll be depolarized, and that basically carries on happening. So that depolarization travels along the axon all the way to the axon terminal, which is where our synapses are going to be at the end of these. Okay, so keep this in mind now when I'm talking about how that depolarization starts here and travels all the way along to the end, all the way to where the synapse is going to be. Okay. We were speaking about how sodium channels are involved in this process of depolarization. Depolarization just generally means that a charge change is happening. So in the same way that sodium channels have ions and ions carry a charge, calcium channels, which are found at the end of at the end of a neuron, they also are going to experience depolarization because there's also ions involved there. Okay, so the same way there's sodium channels going all along the axon, right at the end of the axon, at the axon terminals where the synapse is going to be. Okay, there are some calcium channels. Okay, so this is what I say. The depolarizing wave, so we see here it's kind of like a wave, like it carries on traveling, depolarize and depolarize and depolarize and depolarize, and it kind of like travels along like that. Okay. So as that wave is happening in the presynaptic neuron, it eventually reaches calcium ion channels near the end of the neuron or near the end of the synapse. So basically by the synapse. Okay. When these channels are activated by this depolarizing thing, obviously the calcium channels the calcium ions are coming in. So they enter into the neuron. And because there's calcium now, this triggers something this triggers basically this process where the synaptic vesicles, which is like basically like a little pocket of something, these vesicles basically pop, if you want to think of it like that, because of the calcium that's coming in, and they release neurotransmitters. So synaptic vesicles, they're basically like little bubbles, if you want to think of it like that. And inside those bubbles are neurotransmitters that are being carried. They basically get forced to pop, and when they pop, they release the neurotransmitters. And then obviously, since that signal is being traveled down, and that's that depolarizing that we're seeing, the signal is causing that depolarization, which causes the calcium to come in. So they work all together, and that signal and the neurotransmitters that have now been released attach to each other, and then they can jump the synaptic cleft. Okay. This neurotransmitter, I said here, can now bind to the signal and carry it across the cleft to a receptor. Remember, we said that receptors are specific to a neurotransmitter. So if our neurotransmitter, for example, is dopamine, there'll be a specific receptor that only picks up on dopamine when it's in the synaptic cleft space. Okay, so they're quite specific, like little puzzle pieces. Okay, now because that channel is being crossed, that cleft is being crossed, okay, depolarization can now happen again, because again, the signal is going to cause a charge change as it travels down, which means that depolarization can now happen in the postsynaptic neuron. And that's basically how a signal carries through. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this? This was in lecture 8, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. If this isn't making sense to you, go and watch that recording. Go look at the lecture notes. I did put them up, and there are some videos that can help as well. But if anyone has a quick question now, I'm happy to answer. All right, I'm going to carry on then. So, amino acids. If you are someone who eats vaguely healthy, you might have heard of amino acids before. Okay. Amino acids are basically the building blocks that make up proteins. In chemistry, a building block, we call them a monomer because it basically makes up a polymer. Polymer is a long chain of a specific type of something. In this case, amino acids will all join together in a chain and form a protein. Okay. There's a bunch of different amino acids. We'll talk about them now. What I want us to note, though, is that neurotransmitters are proteins. Okay, so that's what's really important. Since those amino acids are forming proteins and stuff, we can then obviously say then that neurotransmitters are made up of different amino acids. We're going to chat briefly when we talk about each neurotransmitter as to what amino acid makes up it. You don't need to know the chemistry side of it, so that this plus a decarboxylase or whatever makes that neurotransmitter. That's way too complicated. All I want you to know is that, for example, tryptophan, the amino acid, makes this specific, I think it's serotonin, makes this neurotransmitter. So you just need to be able to match them up, basically. This is the general structure of an amino acid. This is like, what's it called? Like a model type one where you can see the different elements. Okay. For my non-chemistry kiddos, okay, N means nitrogen, H means hydrogen, C means carbon, O means oxygen. The single lines are all meaning a single bond. The double line here we see with the C and the O is a double bond. And the R basically means the rest of it. I always taught my chemistry kids R is rest, okay? Which means that all amino acids have this basic structure, but then they all have a different rest of the molecule that makes them look different from each other. Okay, as far as amino acids go, I just want you to be able to tell me that an amino acid is made up of an amine group, a carboxylic acid, and an R group. Okay. There are 20 amino acids. There are non-essential amino acids. Before people start panicking, you don't need to know this. You just need to know the specific few that we're going to highlight, okay? The non-essential amino acids are the ones that we get from our diet. They are isoleucine, leucine, valine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, histidine, lysine, threonine, methionine. Okay, another important one that I want you to take a note of is glutamine. Okay, you don't need to know this. You don't need to know the chemical structure. If you do biochemistry 2 next year, if you say you're first year and next year you're going to be doing biochemistry 2, I do want to pre-warn you, you have to learn all 20 of them and like a heck of a lot of components and structures and properties of them. So yeah, pre-warning. But anyway, so I highlighted a few. You can see here as a nice key. The essential ones are the ones with the funny little dotted line thing going on. All right. Amino acids are required for some of our key neurotransmitters that we're going to be talking about today. For example, histidine, which is this bad boy over here, histidine, it is the amino acid that is going to make up histamine. Okay, histamine is a type of neurotransmitter. If you're someone with allergies, histamine might sound a bit familiar. We'll be chatting about it just now. Okay, glutamate is an interesting one out of the neurotransmitters. So all the neurotransmitters I've put in a color here, except for norepinephrine, because I am a horrible person and forgot to do it. But basically, glutamate's an interesting one because glutamate is actually just a derivative of glutamine. So nothing has changed. Like here with histidine, it gets changed a little bit into a separate molecule called histamine. With glutamate, it is basically just a little bit of glutamine and glutamic acid derived a little bit, like just with a slight change. Glutamic acid is actually quite a good one to look at rather, but we'll get into more depth just now when we're talking about this. But basically what you need to know is that glutamate, it comes from glutamic acid or glutamine. Okay. Glutamate then can turn into GABA. So GABA also requires that glutamic acid and glutamine. Okay. I didn't put glutamine here or glutamic acid because I didn't want to confuse anyone. But basically, the three that I've mentioned here are histidine, tryptophan, and tyrosine. Histidine's there, tryptophan is there, and where's the last one? Tyrosine. So tyrosine will be here. Okay, those make up basically the things that we need to talk about today. Okay, tryptophan, this one over here, you can see it's got a phenol group. Okay, that little ring structure is called a phenol group. And it's got this little thing attached to it. Don't need to know all those things. That is going to basically change a little bit and become serotonin. And then tyrosine gets changed a little bit. You can see it's also got that little phenol group. It changes a little bit and becomes dopamine. And then dopamine can change a little bit and become norepinephrine. Okay. There's another neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which is made from choline. So it's not directly amino acids. Like, I don't want to get a bit too complex with this. So all you need to know is if I say what amino acid makes up histamine, you say histidine. What amino acid makes up serotonin, you say tryptophan. What amino acid makes up dopamine and norepinephrine, tyrosine. Okay, those are the main three that we're going to chat about. And then, yeah, glutamate and GABA obviously are from that glutamic acid and glutamine. Yes, all right. Don't worry too much about this if this is making no sense. We're going to go detail by detail for each of those specific neurotransmitters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, starting with this guy. I see someone's raised their hand. Would you like to ask a question?
Does tyrosine have to become dopamine first to then become norepinephrine, or can it go straight to the other?
It can go straight to it, but basically, if you had to go and Google for yourself, dopamine synthesis or serotonin synthesis, you'll see a bunch of steps where this molecule, an oxygen is added, and then it becomes this molecule, a hydrogen is removed, it becomes this molecule. So there's like a bunch of different steps. To get to norepinephrine, you kind of have to go via dopamine. It doesn't have to stop there. It can basically be dopamine and immediately something else is added and it becomes norepinephrine. But yes, technically tyrosine becomes dopamine and then it becomes norepinephrine. So it's part of the steps. All right.
Thank you.
Cool. So neurotransmitters, now we're going to talk about each of them. This is going to tie in very well to what we're going to be doing tomorrow and Thursday, which is going to be drugs, basically different types of drugs and how they affect us. I think we'll also be talking about substance abuse and stuff, and I was going to chat briefly about some of the neurotransmitter drugs, specifically just SSRIs and SNRIs. And then on Monday and Tuesday next week, we're going to be talking about some psychopathology stuff or neuropathology, whatever you want to call it, neuropsychiatry, literally whatever floats your boat, you can call it that. And that's basically disorders that can result as a, disorders that result because neurotransmitters aren't being fired properly, or you don't have enough of it being reuptaken in your body, or you have too much of it or something like that. And yeah, so for example, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, ADHD, those types of things. Okay, so this is forming the chemistry basis. Psychiatry is in the medical field, yes, but you are trained in it as a psychologist. Psychiatry itself just basically means the medical side of psychology. But as a psychologist, especially a biological psychologist or neuropsychologist, you do need to know these things because you work very, very closely to psychiatrists. Only difference between a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist is they can prescribe drugs and they study for way longer and get paid a bit more. Okay, so it is important for us in our scope of practice to know these things. All right, so these are some of the ones we're going to be talking about: acetylcholine, dopamine, GABA, norepinephrine, and serotonin. I included this table because I thought it was quite a useful one, and it kind of shows that, like, if your norepinephrine levels are quite high, it could result in anxiety. If your norepinephrine levels are quite low, it could result in depression, etc., etc. So it's like a nice, like, key summary thing. It isn't enough though if you just had to learn this. You do need to go through the slides that we're going to go through now. Okay, first one I said I want you to start with is acetylcholine. This is the molecule of acetylcholine. You do not need to know how to draw this or how to understand it. I would expect you to kind of vaguely know what it looks like. So if I gave it this one to you and I gave serotonin to you, I want you to know the difference, just to make it a bit tricky, because trickier. Otherwise, this is just learning. This is something that is a little bit more complex and higher level stuff. And obviously, we're in university now. We do want to keep it at a good standard. Okay. Acetylcholine is what we call an excitatory or excitatory. I'm going to say excitatory so we can think excited neurotransmitter. An excitatory neurotransmitter basically means that it encourages a target cell to take action. So excitatory, you can think of it as like a hype man. It's literally just like being like, okay, cool, we're going to fight, we're going to fire, we're going to fight, we're going to do something. Okay. That's what an excitatory neurotransmitter is doing. The location where most acetylcholine is involved is the basal ganglia, the caudate and putamen, and then obviously it's quite involved in our peripheral nervous system. Okay, as I said here, it's involved in muscle contractions, hormone release, heartbeat, brain function, memory, all of that stuff. We can see acetylcholine here, and then it's got the receptors. Remember, we were talking about the different types of receptors. It can be muscarinic or it can be nicotinic. Okay. If this is sounding like absolute hogwash to you, you've missed a lecture or you haven't studied. This was covered in the peripheral nervous system lectures, which I think was lecture 4 or 5. Okay. Continued on acetylcholine. This is directly from those slides that I was just chatting about. Okay. And you can see at each of these points, the neurotransmitter that was involved was acetylcholine. ACH, 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 then again here and here. Okay. If our acetylcholine levels are too low, we're going to have memory and thinking issues. Okay. So if there are low levels of acetylcholine, this is probably implicated in Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's disease. Some medication that people can be prescribed for Alzheimer's, it works to basically slow that breakdown of acetylcholine in the body. What I mean by the breakdown of acetylcholine is if we go all the way back here to this slide, you can see that, the previous slide. We can see that some of them are metabolized or degraded. So instead of being used up again and retransported up, sometimes they are degraded and sometimes they just aren't attached to anything and they just get metabolized immediately. What those drugs then for Alzheimer's aim to do is basically tell the body, look, we can't spare any acetylcholine. We're not going to break that down. We're going to reuptake it. Okay. The word reuptake might ring a bell just now when we talk about SSRIs and SNRIs. That's basically how those drugs work. They basically tell the body, okay, no, we're taking in too much. We need to let go. Okay. Because it's a reuptake inhibitor. So it's stopping the body from taking in too much. We're going to see why too much of something can be bad, too low of something can be bad, all of that stuff. So in the case of acetylcholine, if there's too low, so too much of it is being broken down, okay, Alzheimer's disease, Huntington's disease, or memory and thinking issues can be a result, okay? If acetylcholine is too high, so let's say your body's reuptaking too much, or you're producing too much for some reason, we're going to have muscle contraction, too much of it happening. Remember, peripheral nervous system and acetylcholine, it's often to do with muscles. So if there's too much acetylcholine, it's causing way too much firing happening. Every time a signal is sent from anything, it's going to send it through immediately and it's going to cause a reaction. Okay, this can result in seizures, spasms, or Parkinson's disease. Okay, I then added a note here on some of the slides. I said ways that you can maybe get more of that in your diet. It's not always proven that if you take a supplement for something that it will improve your levels of acetylcholine and stuff, because our body has a weird way of breaking any protein that comes down in a supplement into different ways. Okay, so for example, a lot of people are buying into like collagen supplements and like putting skin serums on that contain collagen because collagen is good for your skin. There isn't that much proof all the time. In some cases, yes, but not all the time, that collagen that we're then rubbing on our face in our expensive skin creams is necessarily being used in our body as collagen, because our body takes it in and goes, ooh, a protein. It doesn't go, ooh, collagen. And then it's going to break down into other things. Okay. So we can get acetylcholine from choline in our diets. For example, ways that we can get it: eggs, organ meat, fish, beef, soybeans, so anything that's rich in proteins. Okay, that's how we can get choline into our diets. I see some people are a little bit confused in the chats. If you do have a question, please pause and ask. I can't guess what isn't making sense. Okay. So we've just covered acetylcholine. The next one we're going to be covering is histamine. Okay. Histamine, that should ring a bell to you. If you've ever had allergy problems, you might take something called an antihistamine. Okay. In this sense, then, histamine has to do with, we'll see on the next page, allergic reactions. Let's see what it does first as a neurotransmitter, and then we'll go into the other things that histamine can do. Okay. Again, it's an excitatory, so it's exciting neurotransmitter, which means it basically encourages firing of signals. Okay. It's made from histidine. The thing that's removed is the COOH group, which is the carboxylic acid group. Okay. All you need to know for me, though, is that histamine is made from histidine. Okay. As I said, it's an excitatory, so it encourages neuron firing. The location in the brain, it's involved in the hypothalamus. Okay, there's also high concentrations of histamine receptors in the lungs, in our skin, in our blood vessels, and in our GI tract. And as anyone with allergies might recall, when you're having an allergic reaction, your lungs get tight, your chest gets tight, you might have a skin reaction, you might see blood vessels bursting, and you might have an upset stomach. Okay. I also added in a note, Mr. Zondo added this in his things, and I thought it was quite interesting. Some antipsychotics and antidepressants can cause histamine receptor blockage. So this will obviously then cause problems with histamine firing. Okay, let's see what this means then for us. Histamine is involved in sleep modulation and food, like appetites and stuff like that. That's its job as a neurotransmitter. Besides a neurotransmitter, it's also involved in mediating inflammatory and allergic reactions, as well as gastric acid secretion. Okay, if you have something called a histamine intolerance, it basically means that your histamine builds up in your body, but is not broken down correctly. So remember how I said some neurotransmitters are going to get broken down? If you have a histamine intolerance, then for some reason, your body doesn't break down that histamine well enough. If there's too much histamine in your system, it's making a lot of firing going on, lots of neurons and stuff, which will result in an overactive immune system. When our immune system is overactive, it basically means that our body is constantly thinking, I'm in trouble, I'm sick, there's an allergen, there is something that is going to make me die. Obviously, our bodies are huge overreactors and then freaks out, and that basically is going to kind of mess things up a bit. Common symptoms: diarrhea, shortness of breath, headache, skin irritation. So all of those things that will then be associated with an allergic reaction. Okay, that's a sign of a histamine intolerance. Doesn't the hypothalamus have to do with memory? Okay, remember, most of these things don't just have one function. Often the hypothalamus also helps with sending other signals to the rest of the body. Okay. Next one we're going to chat about, glutamate. Okay, it is an anion of glutamic acid. So the same thing where here for histamine, I wanted you to be able to say it's made from histidine. For glutamate, I want you to be able to tell me it's an anion of glutamic acid, which basically means it has a negative charge. Like it's the same molecule, but the charge is different. Okay, you don't need to know that. Only know glutamate is an anion of glutamic acid. Done. Okay, again, it is also an excitatory neurotransmitter, which means it encourages firing of neurons. Glutamate is quite a common bad boy, okay? I didn't really know about glutamate because it's kind of just everywhere. So it's not one of those like main ones that like, if there's a problem, this and this happens. But basically what we need to know is that it's present in 90% of all brain synapses because it is involved in so many processes and stuff. If we have too much glutamate, it's disrupting our nerve health and communication. So since it's in so many synapses and stuff like that, if there's too much of glutamate, it's basically going to mess up the way that our brain and our central nervous system is able to send neural signals, okay? Either from a neuron to a site, like a muscle or something like that, or from a neuron to another neuron to another neuron to a part of our body, okay? Since there's a disruption to nerve health and communication and it's being overfired basically, because we said it's excitatory. So if there's too much excitatory, it's going to basically make it like really go overboard. We can see epilepsy, we can see schizophrenia, and we can see Alzheimer's disease. Okay. You can see here, it has a little like infograph about epilepsy. Epilepsy is a disorder marked by disturbed electrical rhythms in the central nervous system. So remember, all those signals and impulses are electrical. So if glutamate is not firing correctly and it's going too much, or there's too much glutamate or an imbalance, or it's not being broken down in the correct way, then there's going to be a disturbance in electrical rhythms. There's going to be too much, and the brain's basically going to be like overstimulated. Okay. And all of those symptoms of overstimulation we'll see in epilepsy, like those muscle contractions and jerking, the brain freaking out, all of that stuff. Okay, I think we will go into some depth with epilepsy, but it's quite a complex one. Yeah, and it can have differing levels of severity as well. Okay, there's different types of seizures and all of those things. Okay. Next one I want to talk about is GABA. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. Don't worry about that. GABA, it's just fine. GABA, you need to know, is made from glutamate. So here's glutamate. GABA is made from glutamate. Even if you look at this, and then you look at this, you can see they're pretty similar. You can see just a couple of things here, like just been taken away and just shuffled around a bit, and then we got this. Okay. Don't worry about it though. GABA though, when we were talking about glutamate, it's excitatory. GABA has the opposite effect. It is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So up until now, we've only been talking about excitatory neurotransmitters. This one is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. What it does is it stops neurons from becoming overexcited. So it's kind of like a check balance, okay? So we were talking about how glutamate, histamine, and acetylcholine, if there's too much of it, then we can have problems. GABA basically, like, you know, sometimes things just get a little bit too excited. GABA just kind of goes, okay, guys, just relax, okay? Like just back to normal. And it basically balances things out. That's what inhibitory does. You might think to yourself, okay, no, but like neuron firing is good. If it's blocked, surely that's bad. Not always, okay? Because remember, sometimes our neurons can just fire a little bit too much or a little bit too unnecessarily. When we talk about anxiety, we're going to see that anxiety is basically the fact that nerve signals are being sent too much because your body is freaking out about something and it shouldn't be. And things like GABA then obviously help to prevent that. Okay, so if you have a problem with anxiety, then maybe there's something to do with GABA imbalances. Okay, 30 to 40% of neurons have a GABA receptor to inhibit, have GABA to inhibit signal firing. So 30 to 40% of neurons rely on this GABA to kind of like even things out in case things get a little bit too crazy. It's synthesized in the nucleus accumbens, which is in the subcortex. You can see it over there. Yeah. I see there's a question.
Good evening, ma'am. I just wanted to ask, sorry for calling you ma'am, but I just want to ask, do our neurons fire according to our conscious decision or to a reaction to the environment? The reason I'm asking is because sometimes we'll have a situation happen to us, we react and then it's done. But then once you think about that situation, even though it's past, your body can react the same way it reacted initially. So is it our conscious decision that fires the neurons, or is it the environment that makes the neurons fire? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, that's actually a really interesting question. So thank you for asking that. But basically, so remember our neurons are always reacting in as a result of a stimulus. Okay, so whether that stimulus be danger that's been perceived by our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, by something we've touched, by something touching us, that's how our neurons know to do something. Okay, that sensory neuron picks it up, sends it to the brain, and then a reaction is carried out. Those neural pathways that we're talking about, from sensory, like in our eyes, wherever, to our brain, and then a reaction is carried out, that's called a neural pathway. What our brain does to kind of save a little bit of brain power is it learns those neural pathways and keeps them in the back of our head. Okay, so that the next time that thing happens, it can kind of take a shortcut and be like, oh, we've dealt with this before, it's this. So let's say the first time you take a psychology test, you might be really, really freaked out. You don't know what to expect. You're quite new to taking tests on Are You Connected? The second time you do it, though, that neural pathway has been established. So you might find you might be a little bit less stressed. Obviously, stress isn't just a result of those things, and stress disorders and anxiety aren't the most rational things and aren't always going to listen to your body being like, no, listen, we've gone through this before, relax, we'll be okay. And then another interesting thing that can then happen is the way that we feel about something will then happen again. So for example, for me, when I'm anxious, like I'll be anxious about something that happens. Like I remember when I was younger, if I would tell like a vague half truth, like I'd vaguely lie to my mom, I would go and feel really, really bad. Now, if I'm reminded of that, I will still go, even though I'm not even doing something wrong necessarily, I'll be reminded of it. And it's because of that neural pathway that's been established. So I hope that answers your question, but that's basically what's happening. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, I see someone's asking, Xanin, I think you mean Xanax, is made of GABA, since Xanax is mostly used for anxiety. No, not necessarily. We're going to talk about the drugs tomorrow. Often they're a combination of different things, and GABA can be one of the things that are used to treat anxiety, but not necessarily all of them. Okay, some people don't have a problem with GABA, they have a problem with a different neurotransmitter, but it's resulting in the same thing. Okay, we'll see that GABA is implicated in anxiety, and so is dopamine, so is serotonin, and so is norepinephrine. Okay, so since it blocks certain nerve signals that are related to extreme moods, it can help reduce fear, anxiety, and stress. So if we have good levels of GABA, then when our body's like, oh my gosh, we need to freak out about something, then GABA will kind of be like, no, relax. You're being a bit crazy right now. Let's bring it down here. And then you can carry on and deal with things. Okay, so obviously if you have a problem with GABA, it can maybe lead to things like fear, anxiety, stress. We'll see that on the next slide. I also added here, answering that question about Xanax, is Xanax made up of GABA? GABA works in conjunction with a lot of other neurotransmitters. So we can't just fix this one and expect everything else to be fixed. It's often a combination of them that need to be addressed. Okay. If GABA is too low, then we'll see anxiety and Huntington's disease, mainly anxiety disorders, because it can cause feelings of anxiety, irritability, restlessness, like your body's just going into overdrive, it's freaking out. There's also been some research into how GABA levels are, like low GABA levels are related to schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, and depression. We're still researching this. There's other chemicals also involved in each of these. So please don't run around and tell people that if they're depressed, they have GABA problems. Okay, not necessarily so. Too low of a GABA level can also cause physical neurodegenerative disorders, okay, which basically means that our neurons degenerate, such as Huntington's disease or epilepsy. If GABA levels are too high, there's going to be Parkinson's disease. So since GABA is inhibitory and it stops things, if there's too much GABA, it stops too many things. And then messages that need to go to the brain to tell our brain to move or something aren't getting there necessarily. And if it's not getting to the movement center, for example, this can cause Parkinson's. Okay, serotonin, a little familiar one for most of us. Serotonin is made from tryptophan. Again, it's inhibitory, so it kind of like slows down the body again. Sorry, I have a question. Does GABA involve issues related to alexithymia? I've never heard of that before. I'll look it up. Okay, I just want to carry on though. We are pressed for time. Okay, so serotonin, it's synthesized in the pons, which is a part of our brain. It is also found in our digestive system, in blood platelets, and throughout our central nervous system. This is what it looks like. It has those two little things like a hexagon and a pentagon next to each other. It helps to regulate mood, body temp, sleep, appetite, blood clotting, and circadian rhythm. Okay, you can see there's a nice little infograph here about that stuff. If serotonin levels are too low, this can be linked to anxiety and mood disorders. So now you might be thinking, okay, she's done it. She's completely confused me now, because now I said if GABA is too low, it can cause anxiety, and serotonin, it also can cause anxiety. You can see now they really do work in conjunction with one another. If this one's too low, it could result in that one being too low. If that one's too low, it could have an effect on that one. They could also be completely separate. Our bodies are complicated things, okay? But we do need to just take notes. Serotonin, if it's too low, it can also be linked to anxiety and mood disorders, depression, okay? Whenever we talk about a mood disorder, it's like bipolar disorder, depression, all that stuff. Specifically seasonal affective disorder, which is seasonal depression, if you've ever heard of that, like feeling sad in winter and autumn. They found that that could be linked to serotonin levels. Antidepressants can increase the levels of tryptophan that produces serotonin. I said the tryptophan derivative, so basically the things that will make up serotonin eventually. The two types that we mainly see are SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and SNRIs, which are serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So it's serotonin and norepinephrine. And interestingly enough, SNRIs can also be used to treat chronic pain and fibromyalgia. Someone asked, can bipolar be linked with serotonin? We'll be chatting more about bipolar, but yes, bipolar does have problems with serotonin and I think dopamine as well. Okay, I also added this little picture here that said like ways that we can try and get more serotonin into our diets. Or to treat serotonin symptoms or serotonin syndrome, sorry, so when there's not enough serotonin. And then also this, if you can't make your own serotonin, store-bought is fine, which obviously means like if you need to take drugs, take them. Okay, just to go through the last two, dopamine is made from tyrosine. It's excitatory, inhibitory, and modulatory, so it has a couple of functions. You can see here how it kind of does a little bit of everything. It's synthesized in our midbrain, specifically the substantia nigra. It's to do with the pleasure reward neurotransmitter. So that's why people think of it. It's involved in pleasure and reward. We release dopamine when we're doing something that we love. Okay. Dopamine is implicated in memory, learning, behavior, movement coordination, muscle movement, and it's obviously involved in pleasure, as we just said. So in cases of addiction, there might be a dopamine problem there too. Okay. If dopamine is too high, okay, this could be linked to schizophrenia. So schizophrenia could be a result of high dopamine levels. If it's too low, it can result in depression or Parkinson's disease. I included a meme here because obviously if you've ever been treated for any form of depression or anxiety, you might be a little bit tired of hearing about dopamine and serotonin. Yeah, basically. We can naturally increase dopamine levels by eating a healthy diet with amino acids in it and vitamin D, but low in saturated fat, which is basically processed fats like oily foods and stuff like that. With exercise, I know every time my doctor told me to exercise and that my depression would get better, I wanted to kick him in the face. Promise you it does help. It also has something to do with gut health. Most of the new research that they're doing is looking at the fact that our gut bacteria, so the bacteria that naturally lives in our intestines and all of those things, there could be a link there to feelings of depression and dopamine imbalances and stuff. Is there a slim or broad margin as to what is considered high and low for things like dopamine? Okay, thank you, Ezra. Not necessarily. This is just a general thing. Like if dopamine levels are higher than what they mainly should be, it could lead to that. And if they're lower than what they should be, it could lead to that. It's not a steadfast rule because the pathway for depression, for example, is not fully understood. So we can't just say, like, take a blood test, oh, you got low dopamine, you clearly got depression. It doesn't work like that. But we've just found a correlation between, hey, this person has depression symptoms. Hey, they also happen to have low dopamine. Maybe there's a link there. So it kind of works backwards rather than like this equals this. Last one, norepinephrine is formulated from dopamine, and it can lead to the formation of epinephrine or adrenaline. Okay, it's excitatory again. It's released by our adrenal glands, which sit on top of our kidneys, and they are implicated in our nucleus accumbens, or just in our central nervous system, if you prefer that. It's involved in alertness and arousal, reaction time, mood, and concentration. Last slide. Norepinephrine is also known as a stress hormone. We were talking about how it's involved in fight or flight in our peripheral nervous system. It can increase our heart rate, trigger glucose release in the blood, and it can increase blood flow to muscles. Too much norepinephrine, we've seen this in anxiety. Remember, like, doesn't necessarily mean you have anxiety if you have too much norepinephrine, and we can't really quantify what is too much or too little, but we have seen a correlation. If norepinephrine levels are too low, there's been studies that suggest maybe this is involved in ADHD with dopamine, not one or the other, depression, and hypotension. I then put the difference here between norepinephrine and epinephrine just for your own understanding. You don't need to know them. Okay, that's just in case you're like, okay, no, but I know that norepinephrine is also called noradrenaline. I know what adrenaline is. Are they the same thing? No, they're not. They lead to one and another. Okay, that's the end of our lecture today. If anyone has any questions, I am available for questions. I know we went over, so thanks for your patience. Let me keep the chat open just in case. And yes, please go back to the last slide. Okay, I shall do that now. Oopsie. Okay, here's the last slide on norepinephrine. I was talking about how it's also a stress hormone and what happens if it's too high or too low. Does anyone else have any questions? Do you have any questions regarding anxiety, depression, ADHD, all of these diseases that we've mentioned? We will be covering this next week. Okay, and we'll go into a little bit more depth about those things and the experiences of these disorders rather than just listing them off and saying what they're a result of. Okay. If you don't have any questions, I'll close the Zoom at 5. Thanks for your patience and for hanging on with me. I know it did go on longer. It's just important that we know this stuff.
Very much.
Sorry, ma'am, I've got a question.
Yes.
Does the body have a negative feedback mechanism for when these chemicals are too low or too high, or is it a matter of we have to ingest it some way or another?
Okay, so the body will produce these things, obviously just from the amino acids and stuff, it will build those up. If things get too high, I said that they will get broken down or they'll get dissolved back in or whatever. If they get too low, it will get reuptake and basically recycled, and then our body will use it again. But yeah, there are mechanisms in place to kind of make sure that these things stay balanced out. But obviously in disorders, there's clearly something wrong with our body's like way of making those things balance out. Okay, so it's not in your head. It's not because you didn't eat enough of something or whatever. It's because your body physically is not processing things correctly and making enough of something, or it's making too much of something. The same as diabetes, you're making too much of something or too little of something. Exactly the same thing in mental disorders. And that's why we should treat mental disorders with respect, because it's actually something physically wrong that's happening. I have someone asking, does that mean that norepinephrine can lead to epinephrine? Yes. So norepinephrine, remember we were saying how dopamine leads to norepinephrine. Norepinephrine can then lead to epinephrine. I know, lots of big words and stuff. These recordings will be on Are You Connected? Indeed, they will. Okay, I'm going to say goodbye. It's 5 o'clock. Thank you, everyone, for attending. If you have any questions, remember, you can email me. Don't message me on